Have you ever wondered why we look at 19th century photographs and feel a strange, almost physical unease? Why, looking at the majestic palaces of Chicago, St. Louis, or San Francisco from that era, we cannot shake the thought that we have been cruelly deceived? Prepare yourselves, because the next few minutes will completely overturn your understanding of the past forever. You were told that this was the age of steam and coal, the age of horse-drawn carriages and primitive manual labor. But I will tell you something that makes historians break out in a nervous sweat. We live on the ruins of a more advanced civilization, and the so-called world exhibitions of the 19th century were not a celebration of progress, but a grand operation to dispose of the past. We were made to believe an absurd fairy tale that shepherds and farmers, barely able to read, erected ancient cities of incredible beauty in just a couple of years, only to completely demolish them 6 months later. Does that sound like a madman's delusion? Then let's turn to the facts, figures, and logic that official science shamefully hides in its archives. Let's transport ourselves to the year 1893. Chicago, the world's Columbian Exposition. Official history states that on swampy soil unsuitable for construction, at the height of a severe economic depression, the so-called White City was erected in just 2 years. The exhibition covered an area of almost 300 hectares. More than 200 magnificent buildings were constructed in the neoclassical style, with domes, colonnades, statues, and a complex hydraulic system of canals, reminiscent of Venice. And all of this, mind you, was supposedly built as a temporary decoration. We are told that these monumental structures, capable of accommodating tens of thousands of people, were made of wood, jute, and plaster. Historians even invented a name for this material: staff. Supposedly, it's just a mixture of plaster with fiber, but allow me to ask you a question that shatters this theory to dust. Have you ever tried to build a dome 80 meters high from plaster and sticks to withstand the wind loads of Lake Michigan? The administration building at the Chicago exhibition exceeded the Capitol in Washington in height. Its gilded dome was visible for tens of kilometers. Do you really believe that such a behemoth could be assembled from temporary materials without the use of heavy construction equipment, which, according to the official version, simply did not exist at that time? The architects and engineers I consulted unanimously assert that calculating the loads for such structures requires extremely complex mathematical computations, and their assembly requires cranes capable of lifting hundreds of tons. In the construction photographs that are presented to us as evidence, we see a strange picture. Scaffolding that looks more like restoration scaffolding than construction scaffolding. We see people in three-piece suits and bowler hats posing against already finished but slightly worn walls. Where are the thousands of workers? Where are the mountains of construction debris? Where is the logistics for delivering millions of tons of materials? Imagine the logistics. To build such a city in 2 years, hundreds of freight trains laden with marble, steel, glass, and wood should have been arriving in Chicago daily. But the railway archives of that time are silent about such traffic. Furthermore, the population of the United States of America at the end of the 19th century was significantly smaller, and there simply could not have been such a quantity of qualified masons and engineers of that caliber. We are told that immigrants built this. Seriously. Starving, uneducated people, fresh off the boats, created architectural masterpieces surpassing the Roman Pantheon in complexity? This is mathematically and technically impossible. But the most terrifying thing is not even how it was built. The most terrifying thing is what happened next. Immediately after the exhibitions closed, these incredible cities were destroyed. They were blown up, burned down, torn apart. Why? The official version sounds like a mockery. Allegedly, the buildings were temporary and began to crumble, or a fire suddenly broke out. In Chicago, in San Francisco, in St. Louis, the scenario was always the same: a fire destroying the evidence. But if it was plaster and tow, why do we see twisted steel rebar, massive brickwork, and granite blocks in photographs of the ruins? Plaster does not leave behind steel skeletons. Plaster crumbles into dust. Yet here we see dynamite unable to cope with the load-bearing structures. This was not the disposal of decorations. This was the deliberate demolition of permanent structures that had stood there, perhaps for hundreds of years, before the arrival of the so-called settlers. Look at the horticulture building in Chicago. A huge glass dome, extremely complex engineering. We are told that it was built to display flowers, and then demolished. Who in their right mind would spend colossal resources, equivalent to billions of modern dollars, on a 6-month amusement during a financial crisis? This is economic suicide. The only logical explanation that comes to mind is they didn't build these cities. They unearthed them. They restored them. They took inventory of what they inherited from a previous civilization, and then, choosing what could be used, such as museums or capitals, destroyed everything else to erase the memory of those who lived here before us. Look at the detailing. Statues, fountains, bas-reliefs. The quality of craftsmanship is such that modern CNC machines can barely replicate it. And we are asked to believe that nameless artisans hand-sculpted this from plaster? And they did it with such speed, as if they had a 3D printer. No, this is a lie. This is a blatant, cynical lie, designed to conceal the fact of a global catastrophe and the redivision of the world. The World Exhibitions were not a demonstration of capitalism's achievements. They were exhibitions of trophies. It was a parade of victors over the bones of a vanquished civilization, whose name was erased from history textbooks. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. If you think architecture is the only discrepancy, wait until we touch upon the topic of electricity and where the light at these exhibitions came from when the rest of the world was using rushlights. Let's talk about light. About that dazzling, incredible electric light that flooded the world exhibitions, turning night into day. Official history feeds us a pretty tale about the rivalry between Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla, about the war of currents and the triumph of alternating current. We are told that the Chicago Exposition of 1893 marked the debut of large-scale electric lighting. But look at photographs of Chicago or Paris at night from those years. This is not the dim, flickering light of early, imperfect, incandescent lamps. This is powerful, even space-filling illumination, comparable to modern laser shows or the neon lights of metropolises. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of light bulbs operating synchronously. And here, mathematics once again brings the official version to a dead end. To power such a behemoth as the White City, a capacity comparable to the consumption of an entire industrial region of that era was required. Where were the power stations located? We are shown the electricity pavilion and giant dynamo machines inside. But electrical engineers, examining these old photographs, notice strange things. These machines are not connected to coal furnaces or steam boilers on the scale necessary to generate such megawatts of energy. There are no giant smokestacks spewing black smoke, no mountains of coal, no complex cooling infrastructure. These units look less like generators and more like receivers or transformers of energy, which were sourced from somewhere else. From where? Pay attention to the spires, domes, and obelisks that stud all the exhibition pavilions. These are not just decor, these are technical devices. There is a hypothesis, fiercely denied by academics, that these cities were built to utilize atmospheric electricity, a technology that was available to a past civilization and which we today contemptuously call pseudoscience. Look at the design of the so-called Eiffel Tower, which was the highlight of the Paris exhibition of 1889. It is a giant antenna, a metallic structure, perfectly conductive, reaching into the sky. And now imagine that all these temporary palaces of plaster and sticks were actually part of a single energy network, a wireless energy transmission system, which Tesla later only tried to recreate, but as we know, his funding was quickly cut off. They did not invent electricity at these exhibitions. They were demonstrating the remnants of working ancient technologies before dismantling them and transitioning the world to paid, controlled energy sources, oil and coal. Let's move on. Technological inconsistencies simply scream out if you look at the details. The World Exhibition in Paris, 1900. Visitors in top hats and long dresses, having arrived in horse-drawn carriages, step onto a moving sidewalk, an electric pathway several kilometers long that carries them through the exhibition. This is, in essence, a horizontal escalator, a complex mechanical and electrical system. Do you want to say that a civilization, whose primary mode of transport was the horse, suddenly builds a futuristic conveyor belt for amusement and then dismantles it for scrap metal? This is illogical. This is economically senseless. If you have moving sidewalk technology, you implement it in cities, you change logistics. But this did not happen. The technology was shown, amazed the savages, and then hidden away. And now let's remember the Crystal Palace in London, built for the exhibition of 1851. A building of glass and cast iron, erected, as we are told, in just 9 months. The area of glazing amounted to over 80,000 square meters. In the mid-19th century, the production of sheet glass of such size and quality was an incredibly expensive and laborious process. The sheets were blown by hand. Yet here we see perfectly flat, enormous panels. The logistics of delivering this glass by horse-drawn carriages without breakage or loss, that's a separate, fantastical story. But the most interesting thing is the fate of the palace. After the exhibition, it was dismantled and relocated. And then, in 1936, it burned down. It burned to the ground. A building of iron and glass burned so intensely that its metal structures melted. The burning temperature must have been extreme, like in an open hearth furnace. An ordinary fire does not melt cast iron beams into a liquid mess. This resembles a controlled demolition using high-temperature thermite mixtures. It feels as if the organizers of these exhibitions were playing some strange game. They opened up preserved ghost cities, brought in crowds to legitimize the existence of these objects in reality, invented a legend for them about new construction, and then destroyed everything that could not be explained by the primitive level of technology of the current century. They conducted an inventory. Everything that was too complex for demolition, everything that could be adapted to be left. And here we come to the most ominous question. For whom were these gigantic doors, 5 to 6 meters high, originally built? Look at the photographs of people next to the doorways of the exhibition pavilions. A human there looks like an ant. Door handles are at head level or higher. We are told, this is for grandeur. This is architectural pathos. But architecture is always functional. You wouldn't place a door handle where it cannot be reached, unless you built it for beings of an entirely different height. The proportions of these buildings, the ceiling heights, the size of the steps, all of this screams that they were not designed for a person 1.7 meters tall. Official science tries to convince us that this is just a style of gigantomania. But why then did this style disappear as suddenly as it appeared? Why, after the demolition of the exhibition cities, did we return to building cramped, low brick boxes? The answer is simple and terrifying. The new masters of the world could not maintain and operate the infrastructure of giants. They needed to reduce the world to their size. They needed to rewrite the standards. But to pull off such a scheme, merely demolishing buildings is not enough. You need to control the witnesses. And here we encounter the demographic enigma of the 19th century. Where did the crowds of people at these exhibitions come from, if population statistics indicate completely different numbers? Who are these people in the photographs, wandering among majestic ruins with blank expressions, as if they don't even understand where they are? Now let's step away from architecture and look at those who inhabited this strange world. Gaze into the faces of people in old photographs of exhibitions or the streets of St. Petersburg, Moscow, Paris, and New York from the late 19th century. Haven't you noticed anything unusual? A feeling of deep dissonance never leaves the attentive researcher. We see majestic ancient colonnades, granite embankments, the perfect geometry of avenues, and yet people wander through them who look like ragamuffins who have accidentally stumbled into a palace. They are dressed in baggy, coarse clothing. They are dirty. Their carriages get stuck in the mud that for some reason covers the foundations of these magnificent buildings. It's as if barbarians conquered Rome and tried to live in its ruins, not understanding the purpose of aqueducts and baths. But the most terrifying thing lies in the dry figures of demographic statistics. The 19th century is a century of inexplicable, explosive population growth that cannot be biologically justified. We are told about improved medicine and hygiene. What hygiene? In cities where, according to the official version, there was no sewage system and horse manure lay in tons, plague, cholera, and typhus mowed down people by the thousands. Yet population graphs stubbornly climb almost vertically. Where did these millions of new citizens come from? The answer might shock you with its cynicism. The 19th century is the century of orphans. Recall the literature of that time: Dickens, Dostoevsky, Hugo. The theme of orphanhood is everywhere. But this is not just a literary trope. It is a reflection of reality. Thousands of huge orphanages opened worldwide in the mid-19th century. In the United States of America, a massive program of so-called orphan trains was launched. From the mid-19th to the early 20th century, hundreds of thousands of homeless children were transported from overcrowded East Coast cities to the Midwest and West. We are told that this was a humanitarian mission. But think about it. Where did hundreds of thousands of children without parents come from all at once? Where are their fathers and mothers? There is a terrifying theory that these children are settlers, survivors or artificially raised descendants after a global catastrophe that wiped out the adult population of the previous civilization. They were brought to empty, unearthed cities, which we now call historic centers, and given a new history, new names, and a new religion. They were led to believe that these buildings were constructed by their ancestors with chisels and hammers. But the children didn't know how to build. They only knew how to exploit what was left. And here we return to the world exhibitions. Did you know that one of the most popular attractions at these exhibitions, alongside steam engines and indigenous peoples, was baby incubators? This is not a joke or a conspiracy theory, it is a historical fact. At the exhibitions in Chicago, Paris, and the Pan American Exposition, there were pavilions displaying premature babies. Spectators paid money to look at glass boxes where living infants lay. Officially, this was presented as a demonstration of Dr. Martin Cownie's advanced medical technologies. But there's a nuance. The medical community of that time rejected these methods, and hospitals did not use incubators. Yet, at fairs, it was the norm. Why display children as exhibits alongside prize bulls and new threshers? Is it not because, for the new masters of the world, the population was just another resource, like livestock? There is a theory that these incubators were part of a program to restore the population after a culling. We were shown not the salvation of prematures, but the conveyor belt production of new citizens. That is why there are so few elderly people in photographs from that era. We see crowds of children, teenagers, young men and women, but almost no deeply aged individuals who could have told the truth about what happened 50 years ago. Memory was physically erased, along with its bearers. Note the strange fashion of that time for mass gymnastic parades and unification. People were lined up in columns, dressed in identical uniforms, and trained in synchronized movements. This was not just sport. This was conditioning. From a chaotic mass of survivors, a docile society of cogs was formed, ready to work in factories, processing the legacy of the past. The Prussian model school system, which was implemented everywhere at precisely this time, had one goal: not to educate, but to instruct, to forbid questioning, to force memorization of invented dates and names of kings who perhaps never existed. Let's return to the exhibition buildings. Why are they so enormous? Imagine a child placed in a giant's house. He will feel insignificant, overwhelmed by the grandeur of the space. This is precisely the psychological effect that was desired. The new people were supposed to feel awe before the state and progress, even though the state simply appropriated someone else's palaces. Look at old engravings and photos of the interiors of exhibition pavilions. Vast, empty spaces where some lonely stands with soap, fabrics, or primitive machines are placed. The volume of the building and its contents do not match. It's like displaying a collection of matchboxes in the hall of a Gothic cathedral. It is obvious that these buildings had a different, functional purpose in the past, which the new inhabitants could not understand or utilize. Perhaps they were transport hubs for airships. Recall the enormous arched spans. Greenhouses for growing food on an industrial scale, or sound therapy workshops. But the settlers dragged in their sacks of grain and steam boilers, calling it an exhibition of achievements. We see traces of total falsification not only in architecture, but also in the very fabric of society. We have been convinced that we are descendants of apes who slowly evolved from a digging stick to an iPhone. But the facts suggest the opposite. We are descendants of a civilization that experienced degradation. We live on the ruins of a world where technology was harmoniously integrated with nature and architecture. And the breaking point, the moment of the Great Reset, was the mid-19th century. But what exactly happened? What event caused cities to empty and the first floors of buildings to sink several meters underground? Why do we find houses with buried windows all over the world, which historians ludicrously call cultural layers? We have arrived at the main evidence, which is literally under your feet. Walk through the historic center of any old city, be it Moscow, Prague, or Rome. Look at the ground floors of ancient buildings. What do you see? Windows that go into the ground. Full-fledged window openings with arches and lintels that are half or completely buried by soil. Official science calls this a cultural layer. We are told that over a couple of centuries, people accumulated 3 or 4 meters of dirt from boots, dust, and horse manure. Can you imagine the residents of the wealthiest mansions and palaces tolerating mountains of dirt, blocking their sunlight, and not cleaning it, but simply moving their doors to what used to be the second floor? This is absurd, contradicting common sense. Dirt does not grow uniformly across the world, covering the ground floors of buildings on all continents simultaneously. These are traces of a global catastrophe. A flood of clay, sludge, and mud flow that covered the planet quite recently, presumably in the mid-19th century. Buildings did not sink. They were buried. It was this event that became the cause of that very reset about which historians are silent. The world exhibitions we discussed were held precisely in those locations that suffered the least, or were unearthed and restored first. Now the puzzle comes together. The organizers of these grand shows did not build the white cities from plaster and sticks in 2 years. They unearthed preserved ancient complexes of an antediluvian civilization, washed them clean of many meters of clay, performed cosmetic repairs, installed glass, and presented them as their own achievements. And then, when the exhibition ended, they destroyed the evidence. Why were they demolished? because it was impossible for the new elites to explain to the population where they obtained technologies that allowed them to build 100-meter domes without a single nail and extract electricity from the ether, when the age of coal and steam reigned all around. It was simpler to blow up these majestic palaces, crush them into rubble, and embed them into the foundations of new, primitive cities, telling descendants that it was merely temporary decor. We live in a society of global cargo cult. We use the remnants of giant infrastructure, calling them subways or sewers, but we ourselves cannot replicate the acoustics of old cathedrals or the polygonal masonry of granite embankments without gaps where even a razor blade cannot pass. We have been given a truncated history, truncated geography, and truncated knowledge about the physics of this world. The world exhibitions of the 19th century were not a celebration of progress. It was an act of solemn closure of a past era, the disposal of the legacy of gods, and the commissioning of a new reality for a reset humanity. Look around. These buildings still stand today, silent witnesses to a great deception, repurposed as museums or administration buildings. Go down into the so-called basements of old houses in the center of your city, and you will see that these were full-fledged ground floors with high ceilings, windows, and entrances that now lead into a blind wall of earth. Ask questions. Do not believe the textbooks written by the victors who seized this world after the catastrophe. History is not what happened, but what we have been allowed to remember. But the truth breaks through the asphalt. The Great Reset has already happened, but our awakening is beginning right now. Are you ready to find out what is truly hidden behind the brickwork of your home? This investigation is only just beginning. Think, compare the facts, and don't let yourselves be deceived.